welcome everybody. This is session 5, Performance Nutrition, and we're going to have 3 speakers this afternoon. Starting off will be Dan Kings from across the road at Aspetar, and talking about where we have come from, nutrition science to practice in track and field. It's going to be followed by Trent, and then summing up at the end with Andrew from the University of Exeter. We'll be talking about scientific advances in performance nutrition to impact on human performance. Okay. And over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Excellent. Well, welcome. It's been a real privilege to be invited to speak today by the planning committee, and I'm really grateful for Aspetar and Aspire for their hospitality so far. So with no further ado, let's climb into this particular session. So in the context of Breaking 2, I'm the pacemaker, and after 20 minutes I'm going to unleash the 2 superstars behind me, namely Trent and Andy. So my bit of this particular session is going to focus on the best sports nutrition management to date. So just recently in 2019, there's been a new IAAF sports nutrition consensus that's been released, which Trent will go on to speak about, and Andy in more detail on certain aspects to do with that, but also his own experience of using performance nutrition to achieve, obviously, results with the elite groups that he's been dealing with. So let's answer the question, really. Well, where have we come from? So this particular session is going to involve a little bit of journey about nutrition and athletics, but also I'm going to bring some of my own journey in to do with my own practice and working with track and field athletes over the last sort of 20 years. So I'm pretty glad to say that, we've moved on considerably from people sucking on wet sponges, being given eggs and shots of brandy when they get to the hard points of particular events. In fact, we've moved on very, very significantly, and that's created a lot of challenges for us within this in the area of sort of elite performance and sport. And we've been asked as practitioners to answer quite a lot of questions and a lot of interesting topics that recently, for example, to do with nutrition have been around not only the physical aspect of athlete health, but also the mental aspect. How we can help our athletes deal with the environmental part of not only their competition, but also certain ways in which the environment has brought into parts of their periodized training, for example, like heat and altitude. How we can help in certain biochemical markers, reduce aspects of fatigue, and perhaps for me as an individual practitioner, the last 3 are very, very significant, where we've had significant challenges over the last sort of 10, 15 years to do with increased doping risks from using supplements. A lot more educated coaches who really are trying to be at the forefront of their practice and asking a lot of serious questions to us as practitioners on how we can help different athletes improve their performance in terms of performance questions. But I guess one of the most significant challenges that we faced as practitioners is how we communicate with athletes and how our athletes actually get information on nutrition as well. And Louise Burke wrote a nice paper on Twitter sphere and looked at that in terms of the amount of messages that were being pushed and who was pushing the messages on using Twitter, and came up with a stat that over 50% of those were from actually sort of non-qualified people to be pushing those messages. So that's quite significant when we look at that in terms of where our athletes get their information from. So where have we come from? Let's bring ourselves back to this question in athletics. This is a little bit of a time hop as to the major statements, the major pieces of research that have been published by the IAAF and the IOC over a last number of years. I mean, interestingly, the first attempt at something was in 1995. The proper go at it was in 2007 with the first IAAF consensus statement on nutrition for athletics. Then we had a more sort of overarching body of work come out in 2010 by the IOC. And since 2010 to 2019, we've really had a lot of more practical things that have come out from those guidelines. And notably, in terms of the IAAF and athletics, in 2013, we had the Practical Guide to Sports Nutrition. All of these things are freely and readily available on the internet. You just have to Google them. So in the context of athletics, though, between 2007 and 2019, in real terms, that's 3 Olympic cycles. 3 Olympic cycles since we've had an update, really, in terms of anything in athletics specific from the IAAF on sports nutrition. So if we go back to really the first 2 parts, so 1995 and 2007, what did they look like? So for those of you not familiar with these things, as you'll see, 1995 was a lot more generic. When it comes to 2007, we start to see a lot more inferences to track and field and athletics. For me as a practitioner, there were a lot of messages that I took out of the 2007 guidelines, and I've highlighted a few here. I guess the ones that really impacted my practice a lot, though, were the ones I'm going to highlight right now, which was, as Trent has gone into in some detail already, is a move towards individualization or periodization, as it's now called. The move away from percentages as a guideline for macronutrients became much more of a grams per kilo, so it became a bit more flexible, a bit more real for us as practitioners. And then finally, then some new interesting work to do with muscle buffers and supplements and how we could actually use those to improve the performance of our athletes as well. So if I was asked as a practitioner, what could I take away from the 2007 guidelines, those would be the key points that I would take. Moving on to 2010, just for, again, this slide is for those of you who aren't familiar, just to take you kind of through this little bit of a pre-journey, if you like. Again, we've got more diversity starting to come in now, with references not only to kind of athletics, but other sorts of sports and events and disciplines underneath these kind of themes. So the theme over the last few years is that there's been greater diversity in the literature and in the consensus statements that are being made. But whatever the diversity looks like, it always boils down to this. You know, there are common grounds in all of these consensus around nutritional support for things like adaptation to training, optimal training, performance, and trying to help our athletes remain at a low risk of injury. Now, in the first address on yesterday, Dr. Jans talked about being able to relate sort of things to the coach and help the coach work through some of this technical stuff. So, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for a coach? And I guess one of the best ways I've seen this described to date was when I was working at the English Institute of Sport, and my colleague, the then head of performance nutrition, Kevin Currell, basically just summarized it very nicely as that. And to this day, you know, whenever I talk to coaches, I still come back to these words, and it resonates with them every single time. Okay, so we've been through a little bit of the preamble to do with the consensus. You've kind of seen the journey of the consensus statements. There's been a big gap between 2007 and 2019 from the IAAF point to do with the consensus statement. But consensuses are made up of science. And as Trent will go into in the 2019 statement, you know, the consensuses are people are invited who are leading scientists in their field of expertise to contribute into the overall consensus statement. So there's been a lot, although there's been no consensus statement, there's been a lot of science that's happened in 12 years. And what I'd like to try and do now is, from a practitioner point of view, is just walk our way through a little bit of that science to see where we are, which hopefully gives a good basis then for Trent and Andy to pick up on in the next few sessions. So starting with the communication side of things, I guess, really. Technology has changed us as practitioners. And a classic example of that is some of the evidence around trying to quantify energy intakes in our athletes. Now we have things like WhatsApp, which is being used to freely communicate with our athletes, get a better picture, a more quantifiable understanding of what our athletes are actually eating. However, technology is also causing us some problems as well. So, for example, with wearables, we've got wearables chucking out RMR data, which is probably hugely flawed by up to sort of 20 or 30%. And when you've got any of those sorts of numbers being chucked out, and we know how, sort of athletes love the numbers, that can be a little bit of a problem. And it can manifest itself as a problem in certain eating behaviors in certain cohorts as well. So a positive and a negative for the use of technology, in the way that things have developed over the last sort of 10 or so years. Moving on, there's been a lot of work being done on training, nutrition, and adaptations. I'm not going to read through all of these, but probably just pick up on a few things to highlight as we go along the journey. So there's a lot of work and a lot of talk on social media about low carbohydrate diets, high fat diets, keto diets, all of the rest of it. Lots and lots of different approaches are being touted to help performance. But the upshot of that is that really, these things have a place potentially for the athlete, as long as an outcome can be physiologically potentially justified. And, in our journal club with Trent the other day, when he came in and presented on Louise Burke's paper on race walkers, we were having a kind of a good conversation afterwards about the potential use of things like low carbohydrate, high fat diets in an acute sense to stress the athlete, to get them used to working under fatigue. That's not to say they would have that approach of low carb, high fat in a performance stage of their preparation. But having that feeling of really having their back against the wall, could, from a psychological point of view, actually help them in their ultimate performance, which they really want to excel at. So, diets don't really exist for athletes. The individualized approach can be one as such that they can be incorporated at different stages of their preparation, if so required. We also have things, for example, now like protein requirements have gone up. This used to be no more than sort of 1.7 on the 2007 guidelines. Now we've got a recognition that when athletes are in a hypoenergetic kind of phase to try and perhaps lean up, lose some weight in a certain period of time, it's good to keep those grams per kilo of protein up to help preserve muscle mass. And some of the other things that we've seen as well, which I don't go into in detail here, but are important, and I've tried to show in little graphs, for example, down here, we're much more now aware through research about the impact factor of different proteins and the benefits of milk protein in getting that good kind of response in muscle protein synthesis from leucine. And as mentioned by Trent earlier on, we're also aware of the importance of timing, for example, the use of proteins potentially before we go to bed. Some strategies remain equivocal, but one area that I've been really faced with since my time here in Qatar over the last 5 years is actually, how we have to change our athletes in terms of their approaches to performance during times of fasting. And whilst fasting doesn't necessarily have an overly significant effect on performance, it does require some pretty big changes in training time and dietary manipulation to support training during those fasting periods. So if we move on our journey now then, so pre-competition strategies, they remain highly individual. There's no particular change there. A lot of the work that we see now in the literature is around the work from Sam Impey, for example, for fueling the work that's required. So we don't always have to super compensate and load our carbohydrates and our calories after every event, because really, you only need to deliver carbohydrates to working muscle based on the intensity and duration of what the exercise actually is. And in some cases, that doesn't require this overloading, this super compensation. We now see these gastrointestinal strategies. Some of the recent work has been done around the word FODMAP, so fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyols, which is basically the manipulation of different types of carbohydrates and their fermentation rates to reduce the stress on the gut at any one particular time. And we have coaches now perhaps in jumps that we see, for example, in Aspire, who work with our colleagues to try and put some of these strategies in place to help in certain athletes to improve just the way that they feel and the way that how comfortable they are during that sort of performance. But also, you know, we've got the gut training strategies that Trent has also alluded to in his previous talk as well. So moving on now, just during competition, a lot of the work that's been done and improvements and science to get these improvements has looked at the use of the mouth, really, in terms of how we can actually create a positive, possibly performance-enhancing response through oral solutions. Things like caffeine now has moved from pills to gums, chewing gums. Sebastian earlier on mentioned the possible use of menthol. Although it's very short-acting, there is potentially a performance-enhancing effect if you take it, for example, every kilometre or so. But actually, with that one comes a problem, because there's a fine line with menthol. If you get the dilution wrong, you activate the pain receptors, so it becomes from a positive ergogenic to a negative effect on performance, potentially. So we have to be very, very careful with things like this. And we're also a lot more aware of the possible uses of mouth rinses, where they may be beneficial and actually not beneficial. And a real area of interest of mine is how the food industry and food science and food technology has caught up. So now we have solutions, we have food supplements with different types of carbohydrates in to improve the absorption of carbohydrates into the gut without the gastro issues, but also without the excessive sweetness as well. And I know Andy's going to talk a little bit about that a bit later on. So moving on quickly, so we have certain things here. We know that 20 to 25 grams of protein will stimulate muscle protein synthesis. An interesting point now, moving on in terms of hydration, is the fact that the 2% benchmark for weight loss as an acceptable figure has now crept, and it's realized that, you know, athletes can lose up to 5% of their body weight and still perform at the highest levels. Some of the things I've learned as a practitioner here are the cultural differences. So my colleague Andrew Murray and Marco Cardinali wrote a paper a couple of years ago on beliefs to do with recovery. That's freely available again on the net if you want to get that. But again, it's important to note for when you come into work into different cultures and when you work with different coaches on what you might face based on their belief system. And importantly, as practitioners as well, we start to see things that have been mapped now to do with hydration and solute content, which are the best drinks to perhaps, you know, rehydrate our athletes. All of these simple science things which really help us as practitioners on a kind of day-to-day basis have really started to come out over the last sort of 10 years. One of the things as practitioners that we're always faced with is this conundrum here, which is basically to do with, you know, there's a limited performance time to get results, otherwise you get sacked as coaches. So a lot of the coaches, the support staff, they want to be innovators and they want to be early adapters to do things. They don't want to be laggards. But there's a fine line between actually, you know, bringing something in that's innovative and early and actually waiting for the science to catch up. So there's quite a skill and an art to knowing what works with, you know, with your athletes. What we've seen in terms of supplements over the last sort of 10 years, the big five remain the same. Beetroot, which Andy's been pivotal in publishing in. Caffeine, beta-alanine, sodium bicarb as your two buffers, and then finally creatine. We're now faced with other interesting challenges as well as practitioners, in that we have things coming off the WADA banned list. So glycerol didn't used to be on the banned list. It's now back. It was back on the banned list. Now it's been taken off. And there are some studies that have potentially shown in heat situations the possible benefit of hyperhydrating using glycerol on performance. So as we approach Doha 2019 and we approach Tokyo 2020, there could be some interesting performance questions being asked there. And finally on this slide, what we also know is the stress that nutrition can actually face on our athletes. Nutrition has actually been shown in the evidence to be one of the biggest stresses for athletes, both inside and outside of competition. So, anything that we can do to help the planning of our athletes when they go to competitions. So this is a map that myself and Juan Alonso did for the Olympic Games in Rio to help our athletes work their way through the village, to give them simple tips in Arabic around food hygiene, and also perhaps the food stations, to actually concentrate on where the foods they are most likely to like will be. So anything practically we can do with our athletes to reduce stress has been shown to improve performance as well. I can send you a copy of that map, don't worry. Okay. So in terms of our journey, the last real bit is to do with injury, illness, and health. We've moved from the female athlete triad to, REDS, which I know, relative energy deficiency syndrome, which I know Trent is going to go on to in a little bit more detail. But as practitioners, historically we always thought that, things were around the females and it was always to do with bone health. But now we know that it's not. It's to do with males just as well as females. And there's also other important health aspects to low energy availability, things like cardiovascular disease, poor oral health, gastrointestinal illness, all these sorts of things. It's just not as simple as bone health anymore. And finally, some of the most probably important work recently to do with tendons and ligaments, to do with collagenous proteins and the use of vitamin C. So in 10 years, we've kind of come quite a long way in the science. But really, I guess when you look at all the consensus statements, there's 6 fundamental common things which run throughout them. And I use this as a kind of a checklist that I work with when I work with athletes. All of these consensus, they all push a food-first approach. Meeting the energy needs of our athletes is hugely, hugely important. The timing and consumption of fluids, carbohydrates, and adequate proteins is huge. And, the consumption of effective supplements, and this is something which is just really not going away. And kind of feeds into my 2 learning points as a practitioner over the last few years, really to do with athletics, is that if there is any one sport that I've worked with out of rugby, football, winter sports, a whole host of, sports, really the amount of inter and intra variation you see in athletes in athletics is huge. So it becomes very difficult to adopt a generic approach to track and field athletes, is my personal opinion. And the second thing is that all we can do as practitioners is try and promote the safety of anything to do with supplements. But actually, when you look at a lot of the research that's out there, a lot of the performance enhancing effects are more to do with placebo than they are actual real results, if you like, clinically significant results. But we're now in a position as practitioners where a lot of the time we face this dilemma when we work with coaches or athletes where they're already taking supplements, and actually taking them away may actually cause a little bit of negativity, in that if they have a bad performance when you suggest they don't take it, that can also be a significant problem as well. So I'm going to finish there because I'm a couple of minutes over. But I hope you enjoyed, which I hope is a good platform from which Trent now and Andy can kick on in terms of the 2019 consensus, and then Andy will talk a little bit more about his endeavours after that. Okay, thank you.